The 1980s. 10 years. 10 MVPs. One golden age. We saw Dan Marino shatter the record books, Joe Montana perfect the clutch drive, and John Elway carry entire cities on his back. But in a decade this loaded, who truly owned each individual year? From the mud-soaked trenches of 1980 to the high-flying perfection of 1989, these are the best NFL quarterbacks in every season of the 80s. 1980, the rise of the Kardiac kids. Brian Sipe. Before the 1980s became the decade of Joe Montana, it belonged to a man known as the leader of the Kardiac kids. In 1980, the NFL wasn't yet the quarterback league we know today, but in Cleveland, Ohio, Brian Sipe was changing that narrative. Sipe was the heartbeat of the Kardiac kids, a team that seemed incapable of winning a game unless it was in the final 60 seconds. What made Sipe the best in 1980 wasn't just his 4,132 passing yards, a staggering number for that era. It was his efficiency. He threw 30 touchdowns against only 14 interceptions, leading the league in passer rating at 91.4. To put that in perspective, the league average was significantly lower. Sipe was a master of the timing route, working perfectly with targets like Dave Logan and Hall of Fame tight end Ozzie Newsome. The climax of his season was the MVP award, but the tragedy remains Red Right 88. In the AFC divisional playoff against the Oakland Raiders in biting cold and swirling winds, Sipe's final pass was intercepted in the end zone. It was a heartbreaking end to a season where Sipe played with more clutch than anyone in the league. He proved that a 13th round draft pick could outthink and outplay the giants of the game. 1981, the birth of the dynasty, Joe Montana. If 1980 was about the grit of the veteran, 1981 was about the surgical precision of the newcomer. Bill Walsh had a vision for a short passing game as an extension of the run, and he found his perfect avatar in Joe Montana. In 1981, Montana wasn't the GOAT yet. He was a young man with a skinny frame and a brilliant mind. He led the 49ers to a 13-3 record, completing nearly 64% of his passes. In an era where 50% was acceptable, Montana was a marksman. But we have to talk about the NFC Championship game against the Dallas Cowboys. The catch isn't just a highlight, it was a schematic triumph. On 3rd and goal, with the legendary Doomsday defense chasing him toward the sideline, Montana lofted a ball where only Dwight Clark could get it. By winning Super Bowl 16 against the Bengals later that January, Montana didn't just win a ring, he validated a whole new way to play the position. He moved the pocket, he manipulated safeties with his eyes, and he showed that touch was more dangerous than power. 1982. The vertical explosion. Dan Fouts. The 1982 season is often a footnote because of the 57-day player strike, but for those who watched the San Diego Chargers, it was a masterclass. Don Coryell's Air Coryell offense was the antithesis of Bill Walsh's West Coast offense. Walsh wanted to dink and dunk. Coryell wanted to burn the house down. Dan Fouts was the torchbearer. In only 9 games, Fouts threw for 2,883 yards. If you do the math, that is an average of 320 yards per game. Over a 16-game schedule, he was on pace for 5,125 yards. Think about that. In 1982, Dan Fouts was on pace to do what it took Dan Marino 2 more years to actually accomplish. Fouts had a legendary cast, Kellen Winslow, Charlie Joyner, and Wes Chandler, but Fouts was the general. He stood in the pocket until the last possible second, taking brutal hits to deliver the ball 40 yards downfield. He led the league in yards, touchdowns, and yards per attempt. In 82, there was no one more explosive. 1983, the master of the moment, Joe Theismann. By 1983, the Washington Redskins were a juggernaut. They were the defending Super Bowl champions, and Joe Theismann was playing the best football of his life. While the headlines were focused on the class of '83 rookies, Elway, Kelly, and Marino, Theismann was the king of the veterans. Theismann's 1983 stats were elite: 3,714 yards and 29 touchdowns. But his real value was his command of Joe Gibbs' complex offense. He had the Hogs protecting him, giving him all day to find Art Monk or Charlie Brown. Washington scored a then-record 541 points that season. Theismann was named the NFL MVP, beating out a crowded field of legends. He was mobile, he was cocky, and he was efficient. Despite a shocking loss to the Raiders in Super Bowl XVIII, Theismann's '83 campaign was a showcase of how to lead a championship-caliber roster with zero mistakes. 1984, the year the records broke. Dan Marino. If you ask any NFL fan over the age of 50 what the greatest single-season performance was, they will likely point to Dan Marino in 1984. This wasn't just a good year, it was a glitch in the matrix. In only his second season, the kid from Pitt took the league by storm. Marino became the first quarterback to ever cross the 5,000-yard threshold, finishing with 5,084. He threw 48 touchdowns. To understand how insane that was, the previous record was 36. Marino didn't just break the record, he obliterated it by 33%. He had the quickest release in the history of the sport. Defenses would send the blitz, and the ball would be gone before the linebacker could even take 3 steps. He led the Dolphins to a 14-2 record and an AFC championship. While he lost Super Bowl 19 to Montana's 49ers, Marino's 1984 season remains the gold standard for pure passing dominance. He was a supernova. 1985, the only chink in the armor, Dan Marino. 1985 was supposed to be the year of the Chicago Bears. Their 46 defense was arguably the most terrifying unit to ever step on a football field. They were making Pro Bowl quarterbacks look like high schoolers. But on December 2nd, 1985, on Monday Night Football, Dan Marino showed the world why he was the best. While the rest of the league was being suffocated by Buddy Ryan's defense, Marino stood tall in the Orange Bowl and handed the Bears their only loss of the season. He threw for 270 yards and 3 touchdowns in a 38-24 victory. Marino finished the year leading the league in passing yards, 4,137, and touchdowns, 30, once again. While the Bears went on to win the Super Bowl, Marino was the only man who proved they were human. For that reason, he remains the best of '85. 1986, the Iron Man, Dan Fouts. 1986 is a debated year. You had Phil Simms having an incredible run with the Giants, culminating in his 22 of 25 performance in Super Bowl 21. You had Marino still putting up massive numbers. 1986 is often overlooked because the Giants dominated, but Dan Marino put up numbers that wouldn't be seen again for decades. He threw for 4,746 yards and 44 touchdowns. To put that in perspective, no other QB threw more than 25 touchdowns that year. He was essentially playing a different sport than everyone else. But if you look at the sheer weight a quarterback carried for his team, Dan Fouts in 1986 was a marvel. At 35 years old with knees that had seen better days, Fouts led the league in passing yards per game. He was the only thing keeping a struggling Chargers team competitive. He threw for 3,822 yards in only 12 starts. If he had played the full 16, he likely would have challenged the 5,000-yard mark again. Fouts was the Iron Man, a veteran who refused to let the new generation take his crown without a fight. His performance in '86 was a tribute to the Air Coryell era's final glorious gasps. 1987, the Duke of Denver, John Elway. 1987 was a strange year for the NFL. A strike led to replacement players, scab games, and a shortened 15-game schedule. But in the midst of the chaos, John Elway became a superstar. Statistically, Elway's 1987 numbers: 3,198 yards, 19 TDs, don't jump off the page like Marino's 84. But football isn't played on a spreadsheet. Elway was the Denver Broncos. He had no legendary receivers, no dominant run game, and a defense that was solid but not elite. He carried that team on his back to a second straight Super Bowl. He was named the NFL MVP because he did more with less than anyone else in history. His ability to scramble, throw across his body, and manufacture wins out of thin air made him the most dangerous player in the league that year. 1988, the No-Huddle Revolution, Boomer Esiason. In 1988, the Cincinnati Bengals introduced a no-huddle offense that left defenses gasping for air. At the center of it was the left-handed Boomer Esiason. Boomer was the MVP of the league in '88, and for good reason. He led the NFL with a 97.4 passer rating. His play-action fake was so good that the camera operators often followed the running back while Boomer still had the ball. He threw for 3,572 yards and 28 touchdowns, leading the Bengals to a 12-4 record and an AFC championship. He brought a cool factor to the Queen City, and while Joe Montana would eventually break his heart in the final seconds of Super Bowl 23, Boomer's regular season dominance in '88 was undeniable. He was the cutting edge of the sport. 1989, the peak of perfection, Joe Montana. We end the decade exactly where we started, with Joe Montana, but the 1989 version of Montana was the absolute peak of the position. After battling injuries and the looming shadow of Steve Young, Montana silenced every critic. His 1989 stats are a work of art. A 70.2% completion rate, 26 touchdowns, and only 8 interceptions. But his playoff run was the greatest ever recorded. In 3 games against the Vikings, Rams, and Broncos, Montana threw 11 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. He led the 49ers to a 55-10 blowout in Super Bowl 24, the largest margin of victory in Super Bowl history. In '89, Montana wasn't just playing quarterback. He was painting a masterpiece. It was the perfect end to the greatest decade the position has ever seen, the legacy. The 1980s gave us the blueprint for the modern NFL. We saw the birth of the 5,000-yard season, the perfection of the West Coast offense, and the rise of the superstar athlete at the quarterback position. These men didn't just win games, they defined an era for a generation of fans. From the grit of Brian Sipe to the lightning of Dan Marino and the cold-blooded execution of Joe Montana, these men paved the way for the game we love today. They played in an era where you could still be hit late, where the turf was like concrete, and where every yard was earned in blood. But as the 90s approached, a new crop of legends like Brett Favre and Troy Aikman were waiting in the wings. The 1980s was a decade where the quarterback became a rock star. Which of these seasons do you think was the most impressive? Was there a year where you think someone else deserved the crown? Let's talk about it in the comments. We love hearing from the fans who were there to see it live. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel as we continue to uncover the legends, the myths, and the truth of NFL history. Thanks for watching.